What happened to servants who overheard royal secrets? Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back in time. So grab some tea, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your brain float away into the strange, not so glamorous back corners of history. We're not talking about the kings and queens in their golden thrones tonight, at least not directly. We're going to hang out with the people lurking in the shadows behind those thrones. The ones polishing the goblets, folding the velvet, and accidentally overhearing things they were never supposed to hear. Because here's the thing about royal households. Secrets were everywhere. Secrets about politics, secrets about affairs, secrets about who actually fathered the heir. And the people most likely to know those secrets weren't the dukes or the bishops. It was the maids, the cooks, the valets, the wet nurses. The invisible workforce that everyone pretended didn't matter, but who actually knew pretty much everything. And if you were a servant who happened to catch a little too much knowledge, well, history doesn't exactly promise you a happy ending. Sometimes it meant a mysterious promotion, sometimes it meant a mysterious disappearance, and sometimes it just meant you had to live your life forever pretending you hadn't heard that your queen was cheating on your king with the stable boy. So let's gently wander through a few centuries of overheard royal whispers and see what happened to the people who, quite unfortunately, couldn't plug their ears. Let's start with the Tudors, because of course we're starting with the Tudors. England in the 16th century was basically one long soap opera, and servants were the unpaid audience. Henry VIII was famous for his 6 wives, but less famous for how many servants got dragged into his mess just by being within earshot. Take Anne Boleyn's ladies-in-waiting. They weren't just there to hold her jewelry and gossip. They were the ones who ended up testifying at her trial. Why? Because they had been around her so constantly that they couldn't help but overhear the flirtations, the whispered conversations, and maybe some unfortunate pillow talk. Did they actually know anything incriminating? Probably not. But Henry needed evidence, and the ladies were conveniently positioned to say things like, "Yes, she smiled too much at that courtier," which in Tudor logic was basically treason. And what happened to them? Well, most of them survived, but not without trauma. Being called to testify against your mistress, knowing one wrong word could either save your life or end it. Not exactly the kind of perk you imagine when you think of working in a palace. Meanwhile, Henry's male servants had their own problems. There's a story about his groom of the stool. Yes, the actual job title. And yes, it meant exactly what you think. The groom's entire purpose was to help the king with his bathroom routine. Imagine being that close to the king for that many years. You'd hear things, you'd hear gossip, muttering, political rants, digestive complaints, things no one else would dare repeat. Did these men ever spill those secrets? No. Because the moment you repeated what Henry said on the toilet, you'd probably end up with your head on a spike. So they became human vaults. Poor, very well-paid vaults, but vaults nonetheless. Let's float over to France. The French court under Louis XIV and his successors was the definition of too many people in one palace. Versailles was crawling with servants, thousands of them. And because the Sun King loved ceremony, there were always at least half a dozen people present for even the most private tasks. He couldn't put on his royal shirt without 3 nobles fighting over who got to hand it to him. Now, did those attendants overhear things? Constantly. But here's the twist. At Versailles, overhearing a secret wasn't always dangerous. Sometimes it was a career opportunity. If you managed to casually mention to the right person that you knew the king had said something unflattering about a minister, suddenly that minister might owe you a favor. Or if you were unlucky, suddenly that minister might want you dead. It was basically office politics, but with wigs and poison. Some servants try to weaponize secrets. The classic example is the chambermaids who became informants. They'd eavesdrop while cleaning the Queen's rooms, then run off to sell the information to political factions. Did it work? Sometimes. But more often, these poor maids ended up accused of slander, locked in a cell, or exiled from court with nothing but their apron. Because the one thing Versailles hated more than gossip was gossip it couldn't control. And speaking of queens, let's talk about the royal bedrooms. Servants there had front-row seats to the most awkwardly public marriages in history. In many courts, consummations were semi-public ceremonies, which means, yes, there were literally servants in the room while the royal couple did their duty. Can you imagine being that unlucky footman, standing there, poker-faced, while the king struggles to get things going, and the queen stares at the ceiling? And you're supposed to later testify, yes, sire, the deed was done. Of course, that testimony was a secret too. If you reported that the king hadn't managed to perform, you might ruin a marriage alliance. But if you lied and said he had, you might be covering up a dynastic disaster. Either way, your job security was a delicate balancing act. One wrong word and suddenly you're reassigned to a post in the freezing countryside. If you were lucky. Let's drift a little farther east. In Russia, the Tsars had a habit of surrounding themselves with sprawling households. Ivan the Terrible's court was notorious for its paranoia. He had spies everywhere, but he didn't need them, because servants already overheard enough to get themselves killed. If a maid heard the Tsar ranting about betrayal and then repeated that to anyone else, it could be enough to prove that she was in league with traitors. Even silence wasn't safe. Sometimes Ivan would accuse servants of knowing too much, simply because they'd been in the wrong room at the wrong time. Under later Romanovs, things softened slightly, but not much. Palace servants were still seen as disposable. They might overhear the Empress complaining about her husband, or the Grand Duke sneaking off with his mistress. And if those rumors spread, the servant was always the first suspect. Some were beaten, some were banished. A few managed to rise by carefully, feeding secrets to powerful allies. But for most, the safest option was pretending to be deaf. And then there's the Habsburgs. Always the Habsburgs. Their courts were famously gossipy, but also famously deadly for servants caught in the middle. Maria Theresa of Austria had such a massive household that even her laundry women had access to intimate details. They'd see who slept where, whose linens were stained with what, and then they'd whisper. Did those whispers ever help them? No, the Habsburgs were masters of crushing rumors. If a servant was suspected of spreading talk that damaged the dynasty, they were gone. Quietly. No one really asked where. The irony, of course, is that the Habsburgs had no shortage of scandals worth whispering about. But the people who knew them best, the cooks, the chambermaids, the valets, rarely left written records. They couldn't. Writing down secrets was like signing your own execution order. So instead, the scandals we know today usually came from nobles. The servants, stories disappeared, which honestly might have been the safer outcome. Now, not every overheard secret was deadly. Sometimes it just meant a servant had to carry a lifelong burden. Imagine being the wet nurse who knows the baby prince isn't actually the king's child. You can't say it. You can't even hint at it. You just smile, feed the baby, and hope no one ever questions the boy's resemblance to the stable hand. Or imagine being the butler who overhears the queen weeping because she hates her. Husband, again, silence is your only option. These servants carried royal tragedies inside them like locked boxes, never to be opened. But occasionally, just occasionally, secrets gave them power. A smart servant might use what they overheard to bargain. A maid who knew about the king's mistress could blackmail her way into better wages. A valet who heard about a treasonous plot might trade the information for a title. Of course, this was a dangerous game. One misstep, and you were executed as a traitor yourself. But in a world where most servants lived invisible lives, secrets were one of the few currencies they actually held. So what happened to servants who overheard royal secrets? The answer is, it depended. Sometimes they rose. Sometimes they vanished. Often they just lived their whole lives pretending not to know things. What we can say for sure is that the golden image of royal courts, the glittering ballrooms, the jeweled crowns, was built on the backs of men and women who were always listening, always watching, and always at risk of knowing too much. And that's just the beginning. Because if there's one universal truth about history, it's that people in power never stop having secrets, and the people closest to them never stop overhearing. The servants who knew too much, all right, let's settle back in. You've got your pillow fluffed, the lights low, maybe a blanket tucked just right. We're still floating through the quiet corridors of palaces, brushing past velvet curtains and half-closed chamber doors. And on the other side of those doors are the people history barely remembers, the servants who knew too much. Let's take a slow walk through some specific stories, because history actually left us little traces of these people, tiny mentions in letters, in court records, or in gossip pamphlets, just enough to remind us that while kings and queens were making headlines, their servants were quietly holding the receipts. Let's start with one of the most famous "oops, I heard something I shouldn't have" situations, the case of Cardinal Wolsey's servants in England. Wolsey was Henry VIII's right-hand man until he wasn't. He knew the king wanted a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and he also knew that Catherine's supporters were not thrilled about this. But what people sometimes forget is that Wolsey's household, packed with cooks, pages, secretaries, overheard everything. They knew who was writing to Rome, who was sneaking letters to Catherine, and who was whispering about Anne Boleyn. When Wolsey fell from grace, his servants were interrogated mercilessly. Officials wanted to know exactly what gossip had circulated in the cardinal's halls. Did the servants really know state secrets? Maybe. Or maybe they just repeated whatever, scraps they had overheard while pouring wine. Either way, some of them were hauled before councils, grilled and dismissed in disgrace. Imagine losing your job because you happened to walk past a door at the wrong moment. Then there's Margaret Giggs, who wasn't technically a servant. She was the foster daughter of Sir Thomas More, but her household role was close to what we'd think of as a companion or maid. And because she was always around, she knew far too much about More's defiance against Henry VIII. After his execution, she actually rescued his head from London Bridge. That's commitment, but it also shows how deeply people in service roles could be entwined with secrets, sometimes carrying them literally in their arms. Now, let's wander over to France again, because the French were basically professionals at mixing servants and scandal. In the 18th century, Queen Marie Antoinette had a woman named Madame Campan as her first lady-in-waiting. Campan saw everything: the humiliations, the failed attempts at producing an heir, the endless petty court politics. She overheard the Queen crying in private, and she overheard courtiers mocking her behind her back. Did Campan spill? Not during the Queen's lifetime. She was discreet, which is probably why she kept her position. But after the Revolution, when everything had gone up in flames, literally and figuratively, Campan wrote memoirs. And suddenly the world got to peek into Versailles through the eyes of someone who had been quietly absorbing secrets for decades. She's one of the rare cases where a servant cashed in her silence later, once it was safe. Of course, by then, Marie Antoinette was long gone, so it was less dangerous, but still, imagine holding on to all that drama for 20 years before finally letting it out in print. But not everyone was as careful as Campan. Take the case of Madame du Barry's servants. Du Barry was the mistress of Louis XV, and her household staff knew exactly what was happening in that relationship. They saw the jewels, the gifts, the late-night visits. And when Du Barry fell out of favor, suddenly her servants' knowledge became evidence. They were interrogated, accused of enabling her extravagance, and some were even arrested during the revolution simply because of who they had worked for. So yes, being too close to secrets could literally get you guillotined. Not exactly the job benefit you'd put on a resume. Let's float north for a moment to Scotland and meet one of the more tragic examples, David Rizzio. Rizzio started out as a musician. He ended up as secretary and close confidant to Mary, Queen of Scots, which meant, yes, he heard everything. The Queen trusted him with her correspondence, her private worries, even her heart. Rumors flew that he knew too much about her marriage, or, worse, that he was a little too close to Mary herself. And what happens when a servant is suspected of knowing too much? In Rizzio's case, he was literally dragged out of the Queen's chambers and stabbed to death by her jealous husband and his friends in front of her. It was one of the more horrifyingly public examples of how dangerous it could be to serve too closely. Being near power meant being accused of sharing it. And if you were a servant, you had no defenses when the knives came out. Sliding eastward, let's check in on Catherine the Great's Russia. Catherine's court was buzzing with intrigue, and her servants were right in the middle of it. She relied heavily on her maids and confidants to help manage her numerous affairs, both political and personal. One of her trusted servants, a woman named Prascovia Bruce, supposedly had the job of testing Catherine's lovers before the Empress committed. Was that true? Historians argue about it, but the very fact the rumor exists shows how much power and danger surrounded servants in that environment. Imagine being remembered in history books as the tester for Catherine the Great's love life. Not exactly what you put in your LinkedIn profile, but Catherine also kept a close watch on loyalty. Servants who betrayed confidences or who were caught spreading gossip could be sent off to Siberia without trial. So if you were sweeping the floor and happened to overhear a secret about a new lover or a political plan, the smart choice was always to pretend the dust was far more interesting. Now, sometimes servants weren't just passive eavesdroppers. Sometimes they actively inserted themselves into secrets. A classic case is the affair of the diamond necklace in 1780s France. This was the scandal where a con woman tricked people into believing she was arranging a secret purchase of a ridiculously expensive necklace for Marie Antoinette. And who helped? Grease the wheels? Servants. Letters were delivered by valets. Messages were whispered through chambermaids. The whole scheme relied on the fact that servants were invisible, trusted to carry notes back and forth without being questioned. When the scam blew up, a few of those servants were dragged into court as witnesses. Did they know they were part of one of the biggest scandals of the century? Probably not. They were just doing their jobs, but once again, being in the wrong place with the wrong overheard secret meant getting pulled into history's mess. Even in smaller courts, the pattern repeats. In Spain, the Habsburg court of the 17th century had a strict hierarchy of household servants. Some were noble-born, but many weren't. And when King Charles II, the famously inbred and tragically unhealthy monarch, struggled with producing an heir, everyone in the palace knew. His servants saw the endless doctor's visits, the bizarre treatments, the desperation, but could they say anything? Absolutely not. Admitting the king was physically incapable of fathering a child would be treason. So they silently endured, watching their monarch decline, holding on to secrets that everyone already suspected, but no one was allowed to speak aloud. And here's one of the saddest categories: the nurses and governesses of royal children. They were in charge of the future of dynasties. They saw which princes were sickly, which princesses were unloved, which heirs were being ignored. They heard mothers crying, fathers raging, and children confessing fears in the night. And yet, their voices were almost never recorded. A few left memoirs, like Lady Margaret Bryan, who served as governess to Henry VIII's children. She wrote letters describing how poor young Elizabeth Tudor didn't have enough clothes or proper food. But mostly, these women just kept their knowledge to themselves. They had to. Talking too much about a royal child's weaknesses could get you dismissed, or worse, accused of treachery. So what we see across all these stories is a strange paradox. Servants were both invisible and dangerously visible. They weren't supposed to matter. They weren't supposed to count. And yet they were the people standing closest to the most private moments of the most powerful figures on earth. They saw the cracks in the crowns. They heard the whispers in the dark. Sometimes they turned those secrets into memoirs. Sometimes they turned them into leverage. More often they turned them into nothing at all, burying them deep and carrying them silently to their graves, which, if you think about it, means history is full of secrets we will never know, because the people who overheard them had no choice but to stay silent. That's the quiet tragedy of being a royal servant. You could be surrounded by jewels, silks, and the illusion of glory, but your life was still fragile. And if you happened to overhear too much, your only real options were silence, exile, or a very early grave. So as you drift off tonight, think of the thousands of unnamed men and women in history who were always listening, always watching, but never speaking. The ghosts of court corridors, carrying secrets that dissolved with their last breath. Secrets behind screens and curtains. Hey there, still awake? Or maybe half drifting. That's fine. We're going to keep gliding slowly through the world's palaces, where the servants stood in corners, bowed low, and quietly absorbed more royal drama than they ever asked for. We've peeked at England, France, Russia, and a few others, but now let's open some heavier doors with creaky hinges and embroidered curtains. Because if you thought European servants had to deal with too many royal secrets, wait until you meet the people working in harems, forbidden cities, and monasteries. The poor things were basically walking confessionals, with the added risk of decapitation if they said anything out loud. Let's start in the Ottoman Empire. The harem, as Westerners love to imagine it, was some kind of exotic paradise full of lounging women and grapes. Reality? It was a strict political cutthroat institution. The women inside weren't just wives and concubines, they were power players. And who saw the whole thing from the inside? The servants, the harem's staff, included eunuchs who guarded the doors and ran the internal hierarchy. These men were technically servants, but in practice they knew more about palace politics than many viziers. They overheard the sultana plotting which son would be favored. They caught whispers about assassination attempts. They literally carried messages between women and the sultan. And of course, being the keeper of too many secrets was risky. The chief black eunuch, the Kızlar Asa, sometimes ended up as one of the most powerful people in the empire. But if he fell out of favor, he could be strangled overnight with a bowstring, and someone else would be promoted to know too much. In the harem, secrets were both the currency and the curse of survival. For the female servants, it wasn't easier. The concubines themselves sometimes began as servants before catching the Sultan's eye, and imagine what they overheard, the jealousies, the rivalries, the whispered promises of marriage. If a maid whispered those secrets to the wrong rival, she could be poisoned by morning. So the safest career strategy was usually silence and perfect memory. Let's drift even farther east, into China's Forbidden City. Now, if you thought Versailles had too many servants, Beijing's imperial palace said, "Hold my tea." Thousands of eunuchs worked in the Forbidden City, and their lives revolved around overhearing things they weren't supposed to. Emperors were treated like living gods, but living gods still had affairs, tantrums, and family drama, and the eunuchs were there for all of it. They dressed the emperor, carried his notes, delivered his meals, and yes, and sometimes they were even present in the bedchamber. One infamous example is the eunuch Wei Zhongxian, who lived in the early 1600s. He wasn't just a servant who overheard too much. He weaponized it. He became the de facto ruler of China by manipulating the emperor and silencing rivals. How? By knowing exactly who had said what and when. Wei turned palace whispers into a political machine. For a while it worked. He lived in luxury, drowning in bribes and gifts. But when the emperor died, Wei lost his protector. His enemies pounced, and he ended up forced to commit suicide. Proof that being the servant who knows too much might make you powerful, but it also paints a very large target on your back. Other eunuchs weren't so lucky. If they accidentally let slip a royal secret, punishment was brutal. Beatings, exile, even execution. And yet the irony is that the entire palace system relied on their silence. The emperors needed them to be silent witnesses, invisible scribes of family dysfunction. And so the Forbidden City became a place where thousands of men held secrets they could never speak, an empire of locked mouths. Now let's pause and take a softer detour into monasteries and convents, because believe it or not, even there, servants overheard royal scandals. Many medieval kings and queens sent their daughters, sisters, or inconvenient wives into convents. And wherever royalty went, their servants went too. Picture a young princess shoved into a convent because her marriage prospects fell through. She brings along a maid. The maid is there when the princess cries at night or writes desperate letters to family or sneaks a flirtatious glance at the visiting nobleman who brought supplies. That maid now knows more about dynastic dysfunction than the chroniclers ever bothered to record. Monastic servants also sometimes heard confessions indirectly. A noble might spill his soul to a priest, and then the servant carrying the priest's wine overhears just enough to piece together a story. Not enough to blackmail anyone, but enough to know that the world outside wasn't as holy as the stained glass windows suggested. And here's the catch. Even in holy spaces, gossip killed. A servant who spread whispers about a nun's affair or an abbot's greed could find themselves suddenly transferred to some lonely rural monastery or mysteriously missing altogether. Silence was golden, but silence was also survival. Of course, sometimes the secrets weren't about scandal. Sometimes they were about fragility. Take the Ming dynasty concubines. Many lived and died within the palace, barely recorded in history. Their servants saw everything. The illnesses, the pregnancies that ended too soon, the tears of women who never saw the emperor again. None of that made it into the official annals. Why? Because servants couldn't speak. The official record shows perfect order. But the servants' eyes saw the human mess hidden behind painted screens. Or take the Ottoman princes locked in the cafes, the gilded cages where potential heirs were kept isolated to prevent civil wars. Who took care of them? Servants. Who knew which prince was quietly going insane? Which one was scribbling poetry? Which one was drinking too much? The servants. They had to smile, bow, and never breathe a word, even as they watched future sultans unravel before their eyes. And let's not forget the servants who tried to leave us clues. Some eunuchs in China did write memoirs, though carefully, edited, of course. Some European valets left diaries filled with careful half-truths. A few Ottoman chroniclers included anecdotes clearly whispered from harem servants. But even then, everything is filtered, cautious, hedged. No one wanted to risk being remembered as the servant who told too much while still alive. The result? History today feels lopsided. We have endless chronicles written by nobles and officials, but the voices of the people who actually saw everything, up close, the ones who knew the private side of power, are almost absent. It's like looking at a stage play without hearing what the backstage crew thought of the actors. So what do we learn from wandering these hidden corridors? That across continents, across centuries, the rule was always the same. If you were a servant near power, you had two choices: lock your secrets away forever, or risk your life by letting even one of them slip. And sometimes, in very rare cases, you could parlay those secrets into influence. But it was always temporary. The moment your master died or your patron fell, your power dissolved too. You were just another shadow in the palace, carrying memories no one else wanted to acknowledge. So as you settle deeper under the covers, imagine the hush of a palace at night. The torches flicker low. The nobles are asleep. But somewhere, a maid is still sweeping. A eunuch is standing guard. A nurse is rocking a royal baby. All of them are surrounded by secrets, secrets heavy enough to crush them if spoken aloud. History doesn't remember their names, but without them, the crowns, the thrones and the dynasties would never have survived as long as they did. Secrets in a modern age, hey again. If you're still with me, awake, half awake, or fully cocooned in blanket land, let's keep floating. So far, we've tiptoed through Tudor palaces, French salons, Russian courts, Ottoman harems, and even China's forbidden city. And everywhere the pattern was the same. Servants who overheard too much were both invisible and dangerously visible. But let's wander forward in time, because even when powdered wigs went out of style and electricity started humming through chandeliers, the quiet problem remained. Servants still heard everything. In fact, with bigger palaces, more complex households, and a growing press eager for gossip, the 18th, 19th, and even 20th centuries put servants in stranger positions than ever. Let's start gently with Victorian Britain. Victorian households weren't just about royalty. They were about the middle and upper classes imitating royalty. And so every big house had its servants: cooks, footmen, ladies' maids, butlers, governesses, stable boys. These weren't just workers. They were living, breathing tape recorders of their employers' private lives. Take Queen Victoria herself. She had a whole army of attendants, but the one who arguably knew the most was her Scottish servant, John Brown. Brown was technically just a gillie, an outdoor servant who helped with hunting and riding. But after Prince Albert's death, Victoria leaned on Brown emotionally. A lot. Too much, according to the gossips. Servants saw her sneaking long walks with him, heard the laughter behind closed doors, and whispered about whether the Queen and her servant were too close. Did anyone dare say it publicly? Not really. But the rumors became strong enough that after Victoria's death, her family tried to destroy letters and evidence linking her to Brown, which of course means the servants who witnessed all this carried those memories silently, never fully confirmed, never fully denied. the ultimate locked diary. And that was the curse of being in a Victorian royal household. You could know everything, the grief, the supposed affairs, the emotional meltdowns, but if you spoke, you'd be ruined. So most stayed quiet, at least until retirement, when a few wrote tell-all memoirs that the royal family immediately tried to suppress. Now, speaking of suppressed secrets, let's drift to Spain in the late 19th century. Spain had endured centuries of Habsburg inbreeding, so by the time the Bourbon dynasty settled in, things were already fragile. Servants in the palaces of Madrid saw kings who were often not entirely fit for rule. One tragic case was Alfonso XIII, born in 1886. He was fragile, lonely, and prone to medical issues. His servants saw all of it. They witnessed his panic during bomb threats, his awkwardness at public ceremonies, his troubled marriage, and then there were the affairs. Alfonso was infamous for them. He had a secret taste for risque films, and guess who handled those arrangements? Servants. Valets and attendants became the middlemen, securing private screenings and covering tracks. Did they tell the newspapers? Of course not. Spain wasn't exactly a safe place for servants to start gossip columns. But decades later, historians pieced together the truth, often from scraps left behind by people who had once been in those rooms, keeping their mouths shut and their eyes wide open. Meanwhile, across Europe, the Austro-Hungarian Empire provided its own endless parade of awkwardly overheard secrets. Empress Elizabeth, Sisi, was famous for her beauty, but she was also deeply troubled. She spent hours each day obsessively maintaining her hair and figure. Who witnessed this? Her maids. They saw her refusing to eat, saw her lacing herself into corsets until she could barely breathe, saw her avoiding her husband, Franz Joseph. And yes, they also overheard her darkest thoughts. Elizabeth confided in servants more than in family. But of course, those servants could never breathe a word. Instead, after her assassination in 1898, a few of them quietly shared memories with biographers. Only then did the world learn just how sad and lonely the glamorous empress really was. Now let's glide into the 20th century. You might think that by now, with tabloids and paparazzi, servants were less important as keepers of secrets. Wrong. If anything, the arrival of mass media made silence more valuable than ever. Take Edward VIII of Britain, the king who abdicated for Wallis Simpson. Before the abdication, servants were already whispering. They saw Wallis slipping into the palace, saw the private dinners, overheard the arguments between Edward and his family. Imagine being the butler bringing in the wine, while the king ranted about how he was going to marry the woman he loved, whether Parliament liked it or not. Every servant in that household must have been bursting with knowledge that the world desperately wanted, and yet most kept quiet. A few talked much later, after the scandal had settled, but in the moment, silence was survival, or take Tsarina. Alexandra of Russia in the early 1900s. Her household staff knew she was utterly dependent on the mystic Rasputin. They saw her inviting him to the palace, overheard the hushed conversations, and watched the Tsarina break down emotionally. They also knew the rumors that Rasputin was more than just a holy man. Whether or not those were true, the servants were living with the evidence of her obsession. But could they say anything? Not unless they wanted to be accused of treason against the throne. So again, the people closest to the truth were the ones least able to speak it. And here's where things get even more modern, but still oddly timeless. Royal households today still employ armies of servants, but now they're bound by ironclad contracts and secrecy agreements. You can't exactly write a tell-all memoir without being sued into oblivion. Still, occasionally, leaks slip through. For example, in the late 20th century, several of Princess Diana's servants eventually gave interviews. They described her loneliness, her bulimia, her desperate need for kindness. They had witnessed her crying, overheard her fights with Charles, and seen the toll the royal machine took on her. But notice the timing. Most of these revelations only came out after her death, when the risk of retaliation had softened. Even in the modern age, the old rule holds. Servants know everything, but they can rarely speak in their own lifetimes. And in Spain again, whispers about King Juan Carlos's affairs and financial scandals often started with servants. They saw who came and went. They saw the hidden bank accounts, the strange visitors. And while a few journalists eventually pieced the stories together, the original witnesses remained unnamed and uncredited, ghosts in the background. So what do we make of all this? From Tudor chambermaids to Victorian footmen, from Ottoman eunuchs to modern palace staff, the story is the same. Servants lived inside the private worlds of kings and queens. They knew who was sick, who was cheating, who was crying in the night. They held the secrets of empires in their hands and almost never got to use them. And the strange irony is that history depends on those secrets, but almost never preserves them. We can guess at what was whispered, reconstruct from memoirs, speculate from scandals, but the full picture is gone, locked forever in the minds of men and women who knew better than to speak. So as you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the quiet footsteps of servants padding through endless palace corridors, carrying trays, folding, linens, opening doors, always present, always listening, and always silently vanishing back into the shadows. Beyond Europe, silent shadows of the East and the Americas. Hey again, welcome back. If you're still here, either you're deeply into obscure palace gossip, or you've fallen asleep and your headphones are just running. Either way, we'll keep gliding. Tonight we're leaving the glittering courts of Europe behind and drifting into other empires, where servants were just as essential, just as invisible, and just as unlucky when it came to overhearing things they probably shouldn't. Because whether you're in Delhi or Kyoto, Cuzco or Tenochtitlan, the rule was always the same. Kings and queens made messes and servants cleaned them up, quietly, with no credit and often no choice. Let's start with Mughal India. The Mughal court in Delhi was a spectacle of silk, jewels, and heavily perfumed halls. But behind that shimmer, a small army of attendants, eunuchs who managed the harems, female servants who dressed the queens and princesses, pages who delivered messages for emperors, and cooks, always cooks, because emperors like Akbar and Shah Jahan weren't exactly shy about feasts. Now here's the thing. Mughal emperors lived their lives in a mixture of lavish openness and intense secrecy. The court was designed so that servants saw and heard everything, but nothing ever left the palace walls. Take Akbar the Great. Akbar had endless debates with scholars, mystical visions, and more than one emotional breakdown when things didn't go his way. Who was in the room? Servants. They poured the water, lit the lamps, and quietly picked up the fallen manuscripts after Akbar stormed out. Or consider Shah Jahan, the man who built the Taj Mahal. His grief over Mumtaz Mahal was legendary, but that grief was first witnessed, not by historians or poets, but by his attendants. They watched him wander sleeplessly, dictate endless plans to architects, and break down emotionally. Imagine being the poor servant refilling his ink while he sketched out designs for what would become the most famous tomb in the world. You'd want to tell someone, but no, you'd just keep refilling that ink pot. And of course there's Aurangzeb, the famously strict son who locked his father in a tower. Do you know who first saw that family drama? Servants. They were the ones who carried food to the imprisoned Shah Jahan, listened to his quiet weeping as he stared out at the Taj Mahal, and then returned to Aurangzeb's side without saying a word. If that's not a recipe for lifelong psychological whiplash, I don't know what is. Now let's drift over to Japan. The Japanese imperial court and the shogunate had a very different vibe, more structured, more ritualized, and more, let's call it delicately dramatic. At the imperial court in Kyoto, servants weren't just helpers, they were part of the performance. Court ladies, known as nyobo, attended empresses and princesses. They dressed them, styled their elaborate hair, and prepared them for ceremonies. And because Japanese courts valued poetry, whispers, and carefully veiled emotion, the servants were in on every sigh, every secret glance, every private letter. During the Heian period, when the tale of Genji was being written, servants basically lived in a world of hushed scandals. Affairs, rivalries, love poems sent under fans. It was all happening. And the ladies-in-waiting were right there, pretending not to notice. Except sometimes they wrote things down. Which is how we know so much about how ridiculously petty the Mii. Nobility could be fast-forward to the Tokugawa shogunate. Samurai may have been stoic, but the shoguns, not so much. They had attendants managing everything from armor polishing to, well, more private matters. And those attendants often got caught between rival factions. If a servant overheard the wrong plot, say a conspiracy against the shogun, they could be executed just for existing in the wrong hallway at the wrong moment, which, let's face it, is the world's worst job hazard. Next, let's visit the Aztec Empire. In Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, servants had a different but equally precarious role. The emperor, called the Huey Tlatoani, or Great Speaker, was surrounded by attendants. Some were slaves taken in war, others were chosen young to be palace workers. They prepared ritual costumes, guarded the emperor's chambers, and, yes, overheard the private side of an otherwise very public ruler. Take Montezuma II. To the outside world, he was godlike, almost untouchable. But behind the scenes, he was riddled with anxieties, especially when the Spanish arrived. Servants were the ones who saw him pacing, refusing food, consulting endlessly with priests. They watched the cracks form in his confidence, and when he tried to negotiate with Cortés, it was the servants who carried the messages, translated the awkward silences, and then went back to cleaning the palace floors. History remembers Montezuma's downfall, but those nameless servants lived through it in real time, up close, with no voice of their own. Now to the Inca Empire. In Cusco, the Inca capital, the Sapa Inca was treated as a literal god, which meant servants were everywhere, ensuring every aspect of his divinity looked polished. They dressed him in gold-threaded tunics, carried him on litters, and even managed his elaborate diet. But imagine being a servant who heard the Sapa Inca complaining of toothaches, or saw him sneaking extra cups of chicha beer. It must have been surreal. This living god was, behind closed doors, just a man with stomach cramps. Did those servants dare whisper about it? No way. In an empire where disobedience could mean death, silence wasn't just golden, it was survival. And when the Spanish conquest came, it was often servants who first noticed the strange foreigners entering the city. They were the ones who brought news to their masters, who saw the confusion, who cleaned up after the meetings. Once again, servants became the invisible witnesses to the collapse of an empire. A quick stop in the Middle East again. Safavids and Mughals, overlap edition. In Persia's Safavid court, royal attendants were often young boys trained for loyalty. They polished the Shah's weapons, kept his robes spotless, and sat quietly in the background during state councils. And like Ottoman eunuchs, they knew far too much. They saw which ambassadors were bribing whom, which royal brothers were plotting against each other, and which Shah was drunk when he should have been ruling. But again, what could they do? Nothing but bow and carry another tray of wine. The universal. Pattern. So, after this long globe-trot, what's the pattern? Servants everywhere, Europe, Asia, the Americas, lived in a strange paradox. They were invisible, yet they saw everything. They were powerless, yet they carried the secrets of the powerful. They were trusted with the most intimate moments, yet never trusted enough to speak. Their silence wasn't just about fear of punishment, it was structural. Entire court systems were built on the assumption that servants would vanish into the background, which they did, until every once in a while one wrote a memoir, or whispered to a chronicler, or left a tiny clue. That's why so much of what we know about history is fragmented. The real stories, the emotional breakdowns, the private arguments, the petty dramas were locked away in the memories of people whose names we'll never know, and maybe that's why it's so oddly comforting. Because when you think about it, history has always had its silent observers. They weren't the kings or queens or generals. They were the ones carrying trays, folding clothes, pouring ink. They knew the truth, but they stayed quiet. And tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you can almost hear their footsteps echoing across marble floors and wooden palace halls. Always there, always silent, always listening. The long silence, closing reflections on forgotten servants. Hey again, friend, if you're still with me after 5 long parts of silent servants and whispered secrets, that probably means one of 2 things. Either you're a night owl who really enjoys obscure history, or you've already half dozed off and are hearing this in that fuzzy state between dreams and reality, which, honestly, is perfect. This story was never about action. It was always about quiet, about the lives that were lived just outside the spotlight. So let's let this final part be less about names and dates and more about reflection. A long, calm look at what all of this means, the echo of invisible lives. If there's one thing we've seen, whether it was the French court, the Ottoman palace, Mughal India, or the Aztec Empire, it's that servants were everywhere, and yet they were written out. The history books shout about emperors and kings, queens and princes. They give us titles, wars, marriages and deaths. But the servants, the people who actually witnessed it all, almost nothing. At best, a footnote. At worst, silence, and here's the irony. Without them, those rulers wouldn't have lasted a week. Who dressed the king in the morning? Who lit the fires in the freezing castle? Who carried the letters that sparked wars or ended them? Who listened when a ruler broke down in tears or whispered doubts in the middle of the night? Servants. Always servants, yet they remain anonymous. They gave everything: time, loyalty, silence, and what they got in return was, well, usually just the privilege of survival. The nature of power, it tells us something about power, doesn't it? True power isn't just about being seen. Sometimes it's about making others invisible. Rulers could afford to be fragile, because someone else was there to sweep up the fragments. Queens could afford scandal, because maids carried the secrets. Emperors could rage, cry, or falter, because attendants pretended not to notice. Servants lived in this strange paradox. They were closest to power, physically, closer than nobles, closer than generals, but socially they were furthest away. One word could end their life, one rumor could ruin them. So they mastered silence. They turned it into an art, small whispers that survived, and yet some whispers did survive. A memoir here, a casual note in a chronicle there, a passing comment in a diary, like the Spanish maid who wrote about Queen Isabella's sleepless nights. Or the Ottoman eunuchs, whose accounts gave us glimpses of the inner palace. Or the Japanese court ladies, who recorded poems and gossip which somehow slipped past censors. Tiny fragments, little cracks in the silence. Enough for us to imagine what life must have been like for the nameless many who watched history unfold. From the corner of the room, the weight they carried. Think too about the emotional toll. It's easy to dismiss servants as background figures, but imagine holding that much in your head and heart, watching your master descend into madness, hearing whispered betrayals, knowing which royal child wasn't really legitimate, being the first to see an emperor cry over failure, then turning around to tell the public he was godlike and unshakable. That's not just silence. That's carrying an invisible weight, a kind of burden no one recognized and no one rewarded. Why it matters. Now, so why dwell on this? Why spend hours talking about people whose names we don't even know? Because it tells us something about history itself. The grand stories we inherit are incomplete. They're filtered, polished, edited. They're the official versions. But behind every official version, there was a real version, a messy human version. And the only ones who truly saw that were the servants, the invisible listeners, the silent witnesses. When you think about it, it's not so different from today. There are still people who move quietly through the lives of the powerful. Drivers, assistants, cleaners, staff. They see everything, but we rarely hear their side. History repeats itself, just with different uniforms. A soft thought before sleep, so, as we close this long, slow journey, let's picture it one more time. A servant moving through a candlelit hall. Footsteps soft on the marble, the faint rustle of robes. In the next room, a king argues with his council. His voice rises, then falls. The servant pours wine, eyes lowered. Later that night, the queen weeps behind a curtain. The maid brushes her hair, listening silently. She says nothing. She'll say nothing tomorrow, too. And in another palace across the world, an emperor scribbles notes by lamplight. An attendant hands him ink, watches him mutter, then withdraws into the shadows. These small, invisible gestures were the heartbeat of history. Quiet, steady, unacknowledged. Closing. Drift so tonight as you drift off. Maybe think of them. Not the kings or queens, but the ones who kept the fire lit, the food warm, the robes ready, the secrets safe. The ones history forgot, but who were always there. Because in the end, what happened to the servants who overheard royal secrets? They carried them. They carried them until they vanished. Their lives dissolved into silence, but their presence shaped everything. And maybe in the quiet of night, that's enough. Sleep well. Hey again. If you're still with me after all these hours of whispered chambers and silent corridors, then congratulations. You've officially survived one of the sleepiest rabbit holes in royal history. Or maybe you didn't survive so much as drift off halfway, which is also fine. Honestly, that's the entire point. So let's take these last minutes not to rush, not to squeeze in drama, but to glide slowly over the quiet truth of it all. A truth that history almost always brushes aside. Shadows behind the throne. Think of her throne room, all gold and marble, everyone staring at the king or queen in the center. But behind the throne, shadows. And in those shadows stand the ones who make the whole thing work. Someone polished the floor. Someone laced the royal boots. Someone listened when the ruler muttered to themselves, pacing back and forth the night before a battle. None of that made it into the chronicles. But it all happened, endlessly. The grandeur we admire was always built on invisible backs, the art of disappearing. If the royals were actors on the stage of history, then servants were the stagehands. They knew the cues, they moved the props, they kept the show running, and then they disappeared. To be a good servant was to vanish, to leave no trace, to be there, but not really there. Present, but never acknowledged. Imagine the discipline of that. To swallow every instinct to comment, to question, to react. It's a strange kind of art, the art of erasure. Silences that shaped history, but silence isn't nothing. Silence is powerful. Every unspoken word was a choice. Every withheld secret shifted history in its own quiet way, because servants could have betrayed everything. They could have exposed affairs, plots, doubts, and sometimes, very rarely, they did. But mostly, they didn't. Mostly they just carried it. And so dynasties survived. Wars were avoided, scandals stayed buried. Not because kings were strong, but because servants stayed silent. A universe of small details. When you think about it, history is full of grand events. Coronations, treaties, wars. But the daily reality was much smaller. A servant warming the king's bed with hot stones before winter sleep. A maid tucking a letter under a pillow, an attendant pretending not to hear a royal sob. Another servant quietly disposing of a love note before anyone else saw it. Tiny gestures, forgotten, undocumented. But without them, the great stories we know wouldn't have unfolded the same way. What they carried to the grave, and maybe that's the most haunting part. Most of those secrets went with them into the grave. We'll never know what they knew, never know what truths were swallowed forever. It makes history itself feel incomplete, like a puzzle missing half the pieces. What we read is only the loud version, the official version, but the real version, the fragile, whispered, human version, was carried away by servants who never told. It's almost like history has a ghost layer we can't quite see. A thought for tonight. So as you rest tonight, picture those nameless people. The maid smoothing out sheets in silence, the valet brushing dust off a robe, the eunuch walking a dim hallway at midnight, holding a lantern just low enough not to intrude. All of them living their lives in the background. Their stories never recorded, their voices never heard, and yet always there, always shaping the world even as history forgot them. The final drift. And that's where we'll leave it. Not with a bang, not with a grand conclusion, but with the quiet that defined their lives. What happened to servants who overheard royal secrets? They disappeared into silence. They became shadows in palaces, echoes in corridors, whispers that never made it to the page. But maybe in remembering them tonight, even briefly, we give them back a little of the presence they lost. And with that thought, let yourself drift. The story has ended, but the quiet remains. Good night. Whispers in the walls. The servant's silent theatre, hey again. If you're still here, that means either you're deeply invested in the fates of long-forgotten royal servants, or you're just lying there in bed, somewhere between consciousness and sleep, letting this monotone ramble do its thing. Either way, welcome back. Tonight we're floating deeper into the servants' world. The kind of world that existed just one door behind the throne room, just one step away from the royal chamber, but a million miles from glory. So let's get comfortable. The candles are low, the fire is dim, and the palace walls are creaking ever so slightly, like they're breathing with you. And behind those walls, whispers, always whispers. The palace as a theatre hears something to picture. A medieval or early modern court wasn't just a workplace, it was basically theatre. The royals were the actors, the audience was the nobility, and the script was written by politics, marriages, and far too much wine. But if the royals were on stage, then the servants were backstage crew. Not extras, not even side characters, just the people moving props, fetching costumes, and making sure the actors didn't trip over their own robes. Except here's the funny part. Those backstage crew, they saw everything. The tantrums before. The curtain rose. The whispered insults between scenes. The half-drunk king slurring his lines in rehearsal. So if history is the official play we read in books, then the real history, the unedited blooper reel, was witnessed by servants. And, of course, promptly erased, sleeping within earshot. Let's take the example of royal bedrooms. Because if you were a king or queen, sleeping alone in your massive bed was out of the question. You needed attendance. Not because you were scared of the dark, though some definitely were, but because someone had to be on hand at all times. Maybe you'd need water, or a candle, or more realistically, maybe you'd die in your sleep and someone needed to notice before the body started smelling. So servants slept in adjoining rooms, sometimes even in the same chamber. Imagine that. You're lying there on a small cot, pretending to be invisible, while the most powerful man or woman in the country mutters their secrets in their sleep, or argues with their lover, or complains about their ministers in a drowsy half-whisper. You, the servant, hear all of it, but you must never, ever react, not even a raised eyebrow, just silence, always silence. When silence meant survival, and silence was everything. It wasn't just a nice habit, it was survival. Because one wrong move, one careless word, and you could lose everything. In some courts, the punishment for gossiping about what you'd overheard wasn't just dismissal, it was mutilation, or exile, or something vague and terrifying like being sent away, which, let's be honest, never meant a comfortable retirement. The irony is that royals themselves were terrible at keeping secrets. Kings blurted out their affairs to hunting companions. Queens whispered complaints to their ladies-in-waiting. Everyone at court was talking all the time. But the lowest servants? They had to be mute. They had to carry entire dynasties' worth of dysfunction inside their heads, without ever letting it slip. The risk of knowing too much. Sometimes those servants just knew too much. And when you know too much in a royal household, your life expectancy tends to shrink dramatically. Think of the food tasters. Their entire job was to stand next to the king, eat a bite of his dinner, and wait to see if they keeled over. Not exactly the kind of resume builder you dream about. But here's the thing. Those tasters knew more about political plots than most ministers. They knew when the king was terrified of poisoning. They knew when someone had tried already. And they knew which dishes made the monarch sweat nervously. Now imagine that knowledge floating around in your head. Do you dare share it? Probably not. Unless, of course, you wanted to test whether the dungeon was as drafty as everyone said. The human side of secrets. But beyond all the politics and danger, there's something very human here. Servants weren't just listening to affairs and conspiracies. They were hearing the little things. The royal child crying because they missed their mother. The queen pacing because she couldn't sleep. The king sitting in silence, staring at a fire too long, maybe wondering if all the crowns and wars were really worth it. History books don't capture those moments, but servants did. They carried them quietly, like private memories. And maybe, in a way, those servants knew the royals more truly than anyone else, not as symbols, not as rulers, but as flawed, restless, lonely people. Gossip. The forbidden fruit, of course. Not every servant managed to stay silent. Gossip was irresistible. If you think today's tabloids are bad, you should have seen palace corridors after a scandal broke. Except instead of magazines, the gossip just slipped quietly from one pair of ears to another, winding its way through laundries and kitchens like smoke. But again, dangerous. There's a reason phrases like "loose lips sink ships" exist. At court, loose lips didn't sink ships, they sank entire families, and yet the gossip lived on anyway. Because honestly, how could it not? Imagine scrubbing floors while overhearing that the Queen's favorite courtier had been seen sneaking into her chamber at midnight. Are you telling me you wouldn't whisper that to someone over bread in the kitchen? The difference is, gossip was a death sentence if it traveled upward, if it reached the wrong ear. So servants perfected the art of whispering just enough to keep themselves entertained, but never enough to risk their lives. The invisible power of listening. And here's where it gets strange. Servants had no formal power. They weren't writing laws. They weren't commanding armies. But in some ways, listening gave them a kind of quiet, invisible power. Because sometimes, a servant who knew the right secret at the right time could bend history. A maid who passed along a warning. A page who hinted at something suspicious. A butler who chose to forget what he'd seen. One little action, invisible in the grand sweep of events, but capable of tipping the balance. Like pulling one thread in a giant tapestry and watching the whole thing shift. A strange kind of legacy. And yet, when it was all over, when the royals died and the wars ended, what was left of those servants? Almost nothing. No memorials, no statues. Sometimes not even names. All that remained were the echoes of what they'd heard. Secrets carried silently into the grave. A legacy made not of action, but of restraint. It's a strange thought, isn't it? That history itself is partly built on the backs of people who never said a word. So as we close this part, picture again those palace corridors, the footsteps fading away, the whispers floating through cracks in the walls, the servant standing. Just outside the chamber door, hands folded, eyes lowered, ears wide open. They heard everything, they told no one. And in that silence, whole dynasties lived and died. The servant who wasn't just a servant. Hey there, welcome back, or maybe welcome for the first time if you drifted off halfway through part 7. Either way, no worries, that's kind of the point. Tonight we're sliding into yet another corner of palace life. We've talked about whispering, we've talked about silence, but now let's dim the candlelight and peer at something a little different. The servant who wasn't just a servant. The ones who wore the livery, carried the trays and bowed like everyone else. Except they weren't really there for laundry or candle duty. They were spies, and let's be honest, if you were a monarch, why wouldn't you turn a servant into a spy? They were already invisible. They were already in the room. And they already had ears so finely tuned they could hear a dagger being sharpened 3 doors away. Palaces. The original surveillance state. We tend to imagine medieval and early modern palaces as these glittering, romantic places, ballrooms, feasts, tapestries. But they were also surveillance machines. Every corridor had eyes, every chamber had ears. There was no such thing as privacy, even if you wore a crown. Especially if you wore a crown. Because for a king or queen, privacy was dangerous. Privacy was where plots were born. So what did rulers do? They turned their own servants into informants, not always willingly. Sometimes it was as simple as this. A minister would pull a kitchen boy aside and say, "If you hear the Duke talking too," loudly at supper, come tell me. You'll be rewarded. And suddenly the kitchen boy isn't just scrubbing pans, he's part of a surveillance network. Sound familiar? Yeah, it's basically the medieval version of wiretapping, just with more candles and less technology. The servant as a spy. One of the most famous examples comes from Tudor England. Because of course it does, where else? That whole court was basically one long soap opera with more beheadings than commercial breaks. Henry VIII didn't trust anyone, which, to be fair, was a reasonable instinct, given how many people wanted his head on a platter. He used his gentlemen of the chamber, his grooms and even his laundresses as informants. They'd listen for whispers, take note of who visited whom, and pass it all up the chain. It's a strange irony. The very people expected to be silent were sometimes ordered to speak, just carefully, selectively, and always in the right direction. Of course, it was dangerous. If you were caught as a spy, not only could you lose your post, but also your head. Because nobles didn't like the idea that the chamber potboy knew more about their political alliances than their wives did. The Queen's ladies, friends, or double agents. It wasn't just kings. Queens had their own spy networks too. Ladies-in-waiting weren't just companions. They were watchers, listeners, sometimes even test subjects for trust. Take Mary, Queen of Scots, for example. Poor Mary, locked up in English captivity for most of her adult life. She thought she could secretly send letters to her supporters. But those very letters, smuggled by her own attendants, opened by spies, resealed, and then delivered. Mary thought she was whispering into a safe ear, but the ear belonged to Elizabeth's intelligence service. The result? Mary's execution. It makes you wonder, how many times did queens pour out their hearts to their closest servants, thinking they'd found a friend only to be betrayed? The invisible ink of gossip. And sometimes spying didn't even look like spying. It looked like gossip. Imagine this. You're a laundress, washing sheets. You notice bloodstains, or perfume that shouldn't be there. Or maybe a letter tucked into the folds. What do? You could ignore it. Or you could casually mention it to a guard, who mentions it to a minister, who suddenly realizes he has leverage over a very powerful duke. In that sense, every piece of palace gossip was like invisible ink. The words seemed trivial, but with the right light they revealed something dangerous. The cost of too much knowledge. But here's the catch. Being a spy wasn't glamorous. It wasn't James Bond with a martini. It was more like walking on a tightrope with no safety net. Because once people knew you were willing to talk, you were. Always suspect. Other servants wouldn't trust you. Nobles might try to bribe you. And if your royal master decided you knew too much, well, you might find yourself dismissed, which, as we've said before, was never as gentle as it sounded. There's a reason so many spies were disposable. You didn't keep them around forever. They were useful, then dangerous, then gone. Servants as mirrors. And yet, in some ways, these spies tell us something bigger about history. They show us how fragile the whole system was. Monarchs looked powerful, untouchable, but their lives depended on the silence or the betrayal of the lowest people in their households. A king could command armies, but one servant whispering to the wrong ear could undo him. A queen could command ceremony, but one maid who chose to gossip could topple her reputation. It's almost poetic. Power at the top of the pyramid, but survival depending on the very bottom stone. The theatre revisited. So let's return to that idea of the palace as theatre. If the royals were the actors and the servants the backstage crew, then the spies were the critics, sitting in the audience scribbling down notes, deciding whether the whole play was worth keeping. And the royals knew it. which is why they lived in constant paranoia, never sure if the person holding their chamber pot was also holding their future in his hands. That's why secrecy was never really possible, not in a palace, not in a court. Not when you were constantly surrounded by people whose job was to be invisible, but whose silence might be louder than anything you said aloud. So as you lie there in bed drifting, imagine again the palace at night, the candles guttering low, the royal chambers sealed off, and somewhere in the shadows a servant leans a little too close to the door, listening, always listening. Because sometimes the servant wasn't just sweeping the floor, he was sweeping up secrets and passing them quietly along. When silence became a weapon, it wasn't always about speaking. Sometimes the cleverest servants were the ones who said nothing. Imagine this. A noble storms into the chamber, furious, ranting about some betrayal. The servant is there, folding linen, eyes down, ears wide open. Later, the noble wonders, did he hear me? Did he understand? Will he repeat it? The silence itself became a form of power. Servants didn't have to speak to influence events. The mere possibility of what they might say, or refuse to say, could unsettle the most confident duke or duchess. It's a reminder that in a palace full of talk, the quietest people often mattered most, the servant's double life. Another strange thing about these spies is that they often lived double lives. To the rest of the staff they were just another groom, another scullery maid, another boy carrying messages. But behind the scenes, they might have been quietly reporting to a powerful minister, or worse, to a rival noble. Some servants even switched sides, depending on who offered the better reward. One week, they were loyal to the king. The next, they were whispering to the king's enemies. It wasn't loyalty so much as survival, and in a way, who could blame them? If your entire existence depended on whether or not you pleased the powerful, why wouldn't you hedge your bets? When royals try to outsmart their own servants, of course, some kings and queens weren't oblivious. They knew their servants might be spying on them. So naturally, they tried to play the game too. A clever monarch might accidentally say something within earshot of a servant, knowing that information would be passed along. It was like planting false rumors in your own household. You wanted the whispers to spread just in the right direction. It's kind of funny when you think about it. Everyone was spying on everyone. Servants spying on nobles, nobles spying on each other, and monarchs spying on their own staff, sometimes through other staff. A palace wasn't just a home. It was basically a live-action chessboard where half the pawns thought they were queens, the servant who knew too much. There's also a certain tragic pattern that shows up again and again, the servant who learned just a little too much. History leaves us only fragments, little hints of these lives. A note in a ledger about a chambermaid, dismissed under suspicion. A stray line in a trial document about a page boy being questioned. These tiny mentions are all we have of people who probably saw and heard more than most of the great lords of their day. And then, nothing. Their names vanish, which probably tells us all we need to know. They were removed, silenced, forgotten. And yet, even though they were erased from the records, their shadows still shape history. Think about it. When a queen was accused of adultery, who provided the details? Usually a servant. When a king was betrayed by a noble, who noticed the suspicious late-night meetings? A servant. When conspiracies were uncovered, who had whispered the first warning? Again, a servant. They didn't sit on thrones. They didn't wear crowns. But in a strange way, their silence and speech steered the course of kingdoms. the endless. Echo, so let's go back to that palace corridor one last time tonight. Imagine the tapestries swaying slightly in the draught. Imagine the echo of footsteps fading into the stone. And imagine the servant standing there in the shadows, holding a tray, pretending to wait. But really, he's waiting for something else. A careless word. A secret exchanged. A moment that he'll later deliver, wrapped neatly in silence to someone who knows what to do with it. The servants of royal mistresses. So here's the thing. When we talk about royal secrets, nothing beats the awkward, tangled world of mistresses, lovers, and special friends who were totally not supposed to be there, but always were. And, of course, behind every royal mistress stood a line of servants, ladies-in-waiting, hairdressers, personal attendants, who saw absolutely everything. These were the people who fetched the love letters, unlocked the side doors, smuggled gifts into bedrooms, and quietly made sure no one noticed when the king spent a little too much time in the wrong chamber. When your job description is basically professional third wheel, imagine being the maid of a royal mistress. Your daily work wasn't just brushing hair and holding dresses. It was also keeping your mouth shut when you saw the king sneaking out at dawn, hair a mess, pretending he had just been on a walk. You couldn't say a word. But at the same time, you absolutely knew more about the royal family's real relationships than half the ministers did. The irony is that some of these servants probably knew who would rise and fall in power before the royal court itself. Because when a king was obsessed with his mistress, her servants suddenly became minor power brokers. They decided who got let in, who got ignored, and which letters mysteriously went missing. The dangerous business of carrying love. Letters, love. Letters, by the way, were the most dangerous objects in Europe for about 500 years. Entire wars have been sparked by less. And who carried them? Servants. Always servants. If you were a page boy trusted to deliver a folded note from the king to his mistress, you were holding dynamite in your hands. If that letter fell into the wrong person's grip, maybe a jealous queen, maybe an ambitious rival, suddenly you were in the middle of a political scandal that could ruin an entire dynasty. And if anyone doubted whether you might have peeked inside the letter, well, good luck proving you didn't. Queens versus mistresses and the servants in between. We can't forget the queens here. A queen's household had servants too, and often those poor women and men ended up in the most awkward position imaginable. Think about it. The queen suspects her husband of visiting his mistress. She doesn't dare confront him directly, because who wants to poke that royal bear? So instead she casually asks her maid, "So, did you see where His Majesty went last night?" And the maid has to decide, in that split second, which way her loyalty runs. Does she tell the queen the truth and risk the king's wrath? Or does she lie to protect the king and risk the queen's icy anger? Either way, she loses. Which is exactly why so many servants practice the art of answering without actually answering. "Oh, Your Majesty, I believe His Majesty retired early last night." Sure, retired. Just not in your bedchamber. When secrets became currency in this world, secrets were currency. And the lowest servant could become unexpectedly valuable if they held the right piece of information. Some servants sold those secrets outright, whispering them to ambitious nobles in exchange for gold. Others used them more carefully, building long-term protection. "I know something you don't" is after all a very effective shield. And then there were the ones who gambled badly, who whispered to the wrong person, trusted the wrong, ally and ended up conveniently disappearing from the payroll and from history. The curtain pulled back, so much of what we know about royal love affairs today actually comes from servants' testimonies. The reason we know that Henry VIII snuck around with Anne Boleyn before divorcing his first wife, servants noticed. The reason we know which mistresses had influence in Louis XIV's court, servants talked. The reason rumors about Marie Antoinette exploded into wild scandal, you guessed it, servants, repeating whispers that started in the bedchamber corridors. They were, in a way, the unofficial historians of royal bedrooms. And while kings and queens could pretend dignity, the servants always knew the less than dignified reality. And again, silence was deadlier than speech. But the most dangerous servant wasn't the one who gossiped. It was the one who didn't. The silent chambermaid. The page boy who smiled politely and said nothing. The valet who bowed, backed away, and locked away the truth behind a blank expression because silence made everyone nervous. A gossiping servant could be dismissed, punished, or bribed. But a silent one? That was terrifying, because you never really knew what they might know, nor when or how it might come out. Let's drift on. So, let's step away now from those candle-lit bedchambers, where love letters burned brighter than torches and servants shuffled carefully between queens and mistresses. The air there is thick with perfume, with secrets, and with the weight of far too much awkward silence. And let's drift instead toward another kind of secret keeper, the people who weren't inside bedrooms, but inside prisons. Servants of jailers, assistants to executioners, the ones who handled keys and chains and who saw things kings preferred no one saw, because servants didn't just overhear royal whispers in palaces. Sometimes they overheard the last words of kings themselves. Now here's a fun little irony. While royal mistresses were technically not official members of the royal household, they often had more servants than actual queens. Louis XIV's mistresses, dozens of attendants. England's Charles II. He practically gave every woman he loved an entire mini-court of servants. And why? Because mistresses weren't just romantic distractions. They were political players. They needed an entourage, and that entourage needed servants. And so you get this weird pyramid where the king has his servants, the queen has her servants, and the mistress also has servants, who sometimes outrank the queen's staff in terms of influence, because again they had access to the one person everyone wanted access to, the king in his softest, weakest, most distracted state. Servants as intermediaries for mistresses. Servants were lifelines. They carried messages when the mistress couldn't show her face. They delivered gifts, not just jewelry and silk, but sometimes the subtle bribes that made politics move. Servants arranged secret nighttime visits, cleared corridors or faked illnesses, so no one would notice unusual comings and goings. In other words, they weren't just maids and valets. They were agents in an unspoken war between the queen, the mistress, and everyone watching from the sidelines. And it wasn't unusual for a servant to have a foot in both camps. One maid might serve a royal mistress by day, but pass information to the queen's ladies at night. A page might pretend loyalty to the king, but quietly slip word to his political enemies. Being a servant in this world meant constant double vision, serving loyally with one hand while quietly protecting yourself with the other. When servants accidentally changed history, every so often a servant holding a small secret ended up shaping the course of kingdoms. Take Henry IV of France. His famous mistress, Gabrielle d'Estrées, had ladies-in-waiting who not only helped hide their relationship, but also worked to legitimize her children and push her toward marriage with the king. Without their whispered lobbying, Gabrielle might have stayed a passing fling. Instead, she nearly became queen. Or think of the Duke of Buckingham and Charles I of England. Buckingham's servants helped him cover up affairs, shuffle money, and maintain influence. And that influence ultimately dragged England into scandals that ended in civil war. The servant doesn't swing the sword. They don't sit on the throne. But sometimes their silence, or their gossip, nudges a whole nation in one direction or another. The servant's tightrope. But here's the real kicker. No matter how important these secrets were, the servant could never act like they mattered. If a servant looked smug, they were done. If they looked too knowing, they were dangerous. If they looked too nervous, they were suspicious. The safest mask was absolute calm, the kind of blank expression that makes you wonder if they're thinking anything at all. It's not that. They didn't know the game. It's that they couldn't look like they were playing it, and imagine the stress of that. Every day, living in candle-lit rooms full of whispers, pretending you didn't hear a thing, while knowing that, if you slipped once, your body might be found floating in a river by sunrise. A servant's reward, of course. Sometimes loyalty paid off. If a mistress kept her influence long enough, her most trusted attendants often rose with her. Servants became courtiers. Chambermaids became noblewomen by marriage. Valets ended up with estates. Because kings rewarded not just the mistress, but the people who made the mistress possible. Without those silent, discreet attendants, the romance couldn't survive. But this was always a gamble. The moment the mistress fell out of favor, and they always did, her entire household usually fell with her. Suddenly, those same servants, who were trusted with golden secrets, were branded as schemers, liars, or worse. Some were banished, some were imprisoned, some just quietly disappeared from the record, as if history itself wanted to wash its hands of them. Secrets as shadows, in the end, the servants of royal mistresses lived in shadows. They walked through candle-lit corridors carrying perfumes, silks, and dangerous whispers. They had front-row seats to the most intimate side of monarchy, the side that never made it into official chronicles, and they learned, better than anyone, that the closer you stand to power, the easier it is to get burned. The servants of royal prisons and executioners. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations, you've officially made it through queens, mistresses, and more gossip than a Tudor dinner party. And tonight, we're going to drift downward, quite literally, into the dungeons. Yes, those cold, damp, echoing spaces under castles. The ones where the stone walls drip, chains clink, and the torches sputter like they're not really sure if they want to be here either. Because here's the thing. Kings and queens might have had golden halls, but they also had basements. And in those basements lived an entire class of servants whose job was to manage the darkest part of monarchy. The prisons, the torture chambers, and, of course, the occasional messy business of executions. So, settle in, get comfortable. We're going down into the shadows, where the secrets were heavier, smellier, and a lot harder to keep quiet. The wardens and their keys first up, the prison keepers. These were servants, but not your typical candle-polishing, bed-making types. They were the ones holding giant rings of iron keys, deciding who got food, who got water, and who got to see sunlight once in a while. You might think being a jailer was simple. Lock the door, walk away. But no, it was never that easy, because every prisoner was a potential political powder keg. Sometimes it was a foreign noble captured in war. Sometimes it was an inconvenient cousin with a better claim to the throne. Sometimes it was a random merchant who annoyed the crown. Each one was a secret waiting to explode. and the jailer was right in the middle of it. Too kind? You're suspected of plotting to help the prisoner escape. Too cruel. You might kill them too soon, and suddenly the crown has no bargaining chip. So the best strategy was a kind of bland, bureaucratic indifference. Not too soft, not too hard. Just lukewarm misery, served daily. Bribes, bribes, and more bribes. Of course, prisoners with money, and many of them did have money, figured out quickly that jailers loved gifts, wine, meat, clothing, shiny coins, even promises of land once they were released. All of these could persuade a servant to look the other way for just a moment. Maybe leave the cell door a little less bolted. Maybe allow a secret visitor. Maybe smuggle in a message written in lemon juice. And here's where it gets fun. Servants who worked the prisons often became some of the most bribed people in medieval Europe. They knew their silence could be purchased, and so could their betrayal. It was a tightrope act. Take too many bribes and someone will notice. Take too few, and you'll miss your chance at a little early retirement. The executioner's assistants, now. Let's shuffle to another corner of the dungeon. Yes, the executioner. We all know the stereotype, the hood, the axe, the looming presence, but what people forget is that executioners had helpers, and those helpers were technically servants. Their job was, let's call it, unpleasant housekeeping. They sharpened blades, they set up scaffolds, they cleaned up, yes, the messy parts you're imagining and worse. They sometimes even helped restrain prisoners before the main event. Executioners were already treated like social outcasts, but their servants, even lower. They lived in the margins, carrying secrets no one wanted spoken aloud. Secrets like how the condemned begged at the last moment, how nobles trembled on the scaffold, how sometimes the blade didn't fall cleanly the first time. And imagine being the servant who had to mop up afterwards and then walk home past normal villagers buying bread like nothing ever happened. It's a reminder that monarchy wasn't just gowns and jewels. Somebody always had to deal with the aftermath. Torture chambers and the quiet work, yes, torture. It wasn't always as dramatic as the movies, with constant screams echoing through stone halls. Often it was quieter, slower, more bureaucratic, and servants were part of that machinery. They prepared the tools, the racks, the ropes, the irons. They kept the fires burning, maintained the water buckets, and sometimes even steadied the prisoner while the questioning took place. It's strange, but in the records, you often see these nameless helpers mentioned only once. A servant held the prisoner. That's it. No name, no detail, just the shadow of a shadow. But those shadows held some of the darkest royal secrets, whispered confessions, half-true accusations, or names spoken in desperation. And again, what do you do as a servant? You hear things you shouldn't hear. If you tell anyone, you risk your life. If you stay quiet, you carry those voices in your head forever. Prison. Gossip, believe it or not. Prisons were full of gossip. Servants often picked up incredible stories from prisoners, not just political confessions, but everyday complaints. A duke might rant about how badly his brother dressed. A priest might whisper about scandals in the church. A merchant might confess to tax evasion. And these servants, going back and forth between cells, sometimes became the best-informed people in the entire kingdom. They knew which noble families were fighting, who was sleeping with whom, and which rumors might explode into war. Of course, they couldn't share any of it, or at least they weren't supposed to. But word always has a way of leaking. A jailer's wife tells her sister, who tells the neighbor, who tells half the town. And suddenly, the royal court is chasing rumors that started with a bored servant carrying a soup bowl down a damp corridor. when silence was safer. But here's the dark twist. Unlike servants in royal bedrooms or palaces, prison servants didn't get much glory for their secrets. They didn't get estates or promotions. They didn't end up married into noble families. For them, the safest reward was simply survival, because if a prisoner escaped or a rumor spread too far, the blame usually fell on the lowest link in the chain, the servant. And punishment could be swift, brutal, and final. So they learned the art of silence, of shrugging, of pretending not to notice, of blending into the background until even history forgot their names. The forgotten shadows, and maybe that's the strangest part of all. We know the names of kings, queens, even the famous prisoners, but the servants who actually held the keys, who actually lit the torches, who actually carried the confessions, they've mostly vanished. No statues, no poems, no chronicles, just faint mentions in dusty records. They were there, holding the secrets of power in their calloused hands, and then they were gone. But their silence shaped history just as much as the speeches shouted in royal halls. And so, as we drift out of these dungeons past the dripping walls and the clinking keys, we'll leave behind those shadows. Shadows that heard too much, spoke too little, and lived forever in between. Let's float upward again toward brighter chambers, because our next stop will be yet another overlooked group of secret keepers, the servants who guarded the private libraries and correspondence of kings and queens. Because if dungeons held dark confessions, then royal libraries held whispers written down in ink. The servants of secrets written in ink, hey guys. Welcome back. If you're still with me and not already asleep, you've made it through dungeons, executioners, and the faint smell of damp straw. Tonight, we're moving from shadows to candlelight, from prisons to parchment, because while some secrets were whispered in bedchambers or moaned in dungeons, others were written. Letters, diaries, state documents, treaties, love notes. And someone always had to copy them, carry them, and sometimes even hide them. So let's settle in. Picture a room lined with scrolls, the faint smell of ink, the scratching of quills in the silence. These are the servants of the written word, the scribes, the secretaries, the letter carriers, people who handled royal secrets, not with swords but with steady hands and quiet patience. The royal scribe first, the scribe. This was the servant with the most boring but also the most dangerous job. Hours upon hours of copying texts, treaties, laws, royal decrees, and the occasional personal letter that probably should never have been written. Imagine sitting there, ink-stained fingers, eyes going blurry, and realizing that you're the first person to read what the king just wrote to his mistress. Dearest jewel of my heart, I would trade 3 provinces and possibly my brother for one more kiss. Yes, that's now in your brain forever. And here's the thing. Once you read it, you can't unread it. Which meant scribes had to master the fine art of pretending they didn't know anything. No nodding knowingly at dinner. No smirking when the queen walked by. Just endless poker face, quill scratching on. Secretaries, half servant, half spy now. Royal secretaries were technically educated men of letters. But at court, that still made you a servant, just one with slightly better handwriting. Their role was to organize the flood of correspondence. Every letter from foreign courts, every request from nobles, every complaint from angry subjects who thought taxes were too high, which, let's be honest, was everyone. But what made them dangerous was this. Secretaries often knew things before anyone else did. They saw the alliances forming, the betrayals in motion, the affairs hidden in flowery words. They were the first to read about wars that hadn't started yet, and the last to quietly file away love notes no one else was supposed to see. And like all good bureaucrats, they learned to survive by being deeply unremarkable, not too friendly, not too distant, just the perfect shade of beige blending into the background while history unfolded around them. Letters that could kill. Let's pause here for a moment, because medieval and early modern letters weren't just gossip. They could be deadly. A single letter could accuse someone of treason. A single document could declare war. A single unsigned note slipped under a door could change the fate of a kingdom. And who handled those? The messengers, the couriers, the servants who ran, often literally, across muddy roads to deliver folded paper sealed with wax. Imagine the pressure. You're carrying something that, if intercepted, might get you hanged. Or worse, tortured for information you don't even have. And yet, to the people at court, you're just the guy with the bag. The temptation of reading other people's mail of course, let's be honest, if you worked in a royal post room, wouldn't you be tempted? A wax seal can be melted and resealed, a folded page can be peeked at, and yes, plenty of servants throughout history gave in to curiosity. Some did it for survival. Knowing what the crown was plotting could help you stay one step ahead. Some did it for profit. Secret information was the hottest commodity in any royal court. And some probably did it just because, well, boredom. And the funny thing is, kings and queens knew this, which is why letters were often written in code or with ciphers only trusted secretaries could unlock. Meaning servants not only had to handle the letters, but sometimes had to decode the royal equivalent of, "Meet me behind the chapel at midnight, don't tell my wife." When servants became archivists, now what happens to secrets once they're no longer fresh? They get stored. Royal archives were the medieval version of cloud storage, endless shelves of parchment, wars that had been fought, treaties that were broken, and occasionally really awkward personal documents someone forgot to burn. And who kept track of all that? Servants, archivists, librarians, quiet figures who spent their lives in dusty rooms, surrounded by the ghosts of secrets past. They weren't glamorous, but they held the keys to the paper memory of kingdoms. If you wanted to know who signed a treaty 50 years ago, you didn't ask the king. You asked the quiet man in the corner with ink on his cuffs. Accidents and accidents. Of course, sometimes secrets disappeared. Fires broke out. Floods destroyed documents. Mice chewed through scrolls, and sometimes those accidents weren't accidents at all. A helpful servant might misplace a dangerous letter. A secretary might quietly remove a page. A courier might drop something by mistake into a river. It was one of the few ways servants could actually influence history, by controlling which pieces of paper survived and which didn't. Silence in ink, but at the end of the day, most of them kept quiet. They had to. Because being caught gossiping about letters or betraying a royal secret in writing wasn't like stealing extra bread. It was treason. So they became masters of silence, silent in speech, silent in ink, silent even in memory, which is why we almost never know their names. The secrets lived in their hands, then faded away, the invisible hands of history. And that's maybe the strangest part. We think of history as being written by kings and queens, but in reality, it was written by the servants who actually held. The pens, their handwriting shaped treaties, their delivery shaped wars. Their archiving shaped what we even remember today, and yet when you flip through history books, their names are gone. Just a secretary or a scribe or a servant. The invisible hands of history working quietly by candlelight, while everyone else fought over crowns. So as we drift out of these libraries and archives, let's leave behind the scratching of quills and the soft crackle of parchment. Because next time we're going to move into yet another overlooked group, the royal food tasters and kitchen servants. Because if the pen could kill through words, the plate could kill through poison. Here's the thing. Sometimes these paper pushers got a little too close to power. Take the trusted secretary who suddenly knows all the king's thoughts, all the queen's complaints, and all the shady side deals with foreign courts. If you're a noble, that's terrifying, because now this guy, a servant, knows more than you, and you can imagine the resentment. Aristocrats spent their lives boasting about their bloodlines, and here comes a secretary whose greatest asset is knowing where the ink bottles are. Yet he has the king's ear. He's reading the letters before anyone else. He might even whisper advice while handing over a freshly dried parchment. Some of these secretaries rose so high they basically became shadow rulers. Others? They fell down a staircase very suddenly, because the nobles had had enough. Funny how those accidents always happen at just the right time. The problem of forgery. Of course, if you're surrounded by ink and royal seals all day, you might be tempted. To improvise forgery was a real concern. A servant with steady handwriting could create a royal order. Maybe an order granting land, or forgiving a debt, or authorizing something the king absolutely did not authorize, like, say, marrying his cousin's cousin who happened to be rich. And while monarchs loved to believe their words were carved in stone, the truth was, parchment was parchment. A clever servant could reshape history with nothing more than a quill and a stolen wax seal. Some got caught, others didn't. And once enough years passed, nobody could tell if that signature was truly the king's or just the neatest servant in the palace trying his luck. Whisper networks on paper. Another thing about letter servants. They sometimes formed their own secret networks. Think about it. If you're a messenger carrying letters across kingdoms, you're basically medieval Wi-Fi. You see everything, hear everything, and maybe you share a little extra with your fellow couriers at the next inn. Over ale and bad bread, servants traded stories. Which kings were fighting, which queens were cheating, which noble had just lost. A duel. A whole underground information highway, running parallel to the official records. Did it change history? Maybe not directly, but it meant the lowest workers in the royal bureaucracy often knew more about the pulse of Europe than the lords swaggering around in armor. Kings who didn't trust paper, of course. Some rulers hated this whole system. They knew too well that letters could leak, scribes could gossip, and archives could be accidentally edited. So they avoided writing things down at all. Henry VII of England, for example, was notorious for keeping things locked in his own head, or in secret notations no one else could read. Other rulers dictated in code words or never allowed a servant to be alone with their letters. Paranoia was baked into the system, because to trust a servant with ink was to trust them with your legacy, and most monarchs knew better than to fully trust anyone, and so the world of scribes, secretaries, and letter carriers was less bloody than the dungeon, less glamorous than the throne room, but no less essential. They were the invisible glue holding kingdoms together, the ones who actually made words travel. Treaties last and gossip spread. Without them, kings would just be shouting into the void. The taste of fear. Servants at the royal table, hey guys, settle in, get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself something warm. Tonight we're drifting into a strange corner of royal history. Not the thrones, not the wars, not even the scandalous affairs. Nope. Tonight it's all about food. Or rather, the fear of food. Because for kings and queens, Mealtime was never just about eating. It was about survival. You and I sit down to dinner thinking about calories, flavor, or maybe whether we should have just ordered pizza. Royals? They sat down wondering if this stew would kill them. That's where the servants came in, food tasters, cupbearers, and an entire class of people whose job was to stand between the monarch and a bowl of very suspicious soup. The origins of paranoia. Let's be fair, the fear wasn't totally irrational. Poisoning was one of history's favorite shortcuts to political change. Why wait for a battlefield when you could slip something into a goblet of wine? It was cheap, quiet, and didn't involve raising an army. So monarchs across Europe and beyond developed a paranoia that would put your most suspicious relative to shame. Every dish was eyed with distrust. Every goblet was a potential threat. And servants, well, they became the first line of defense. Enter the food taster, the unlucky human shield, the job nobody really wanted. Being a royal taster sounds glamorous. At first glance, you're dining at the king's table, tasting the finest foods of the realm. Roast swan, spiced pears, imported wine. It's a feast every day, except, of course, for the fact that any bite might be your last. The process was simple. The servant took a sample of the food or drink before it touched royal lips. If the servant keeled over, frothing at the mouth, well, mystery solved. Dinner cancelled. Send for the physician. It's honestly amazing that anyone accepted the job. But here's the thing. In a world where being a servant could mean backbreaking work, poverty, and obscurity, some people actually considered tasting poison soup a step up. At least you were close to power. At least your name might be remembered. In the coroner's notes, cupbearers and the ritual of trust, the same paranoia extended to drinks. In many courts, the role of the cupbearer was a high-status position, sometimes even filled by nobility. It wasn't just about pouring wine. It was about trust. The cupbearer was the one who handed the chalice directly to the king, which meant he had the power to protect and or betray. This role became so symbolically important that in some places, being cupbearer practically guaranteed influence. Ancient Persia had royal cupbearers who became trusted advisors. In medieval courts, it was the same. The man holding the wine jug had the king's ear. Literally, it's kind of funny, though. Imagine being a powerful noble and realizing your rank comes down to how elegantly you pour liquid into a goblet. That's history for you. Did it actually work? Here's the awkward truth. Food tasting wasn't foolproof. Some poisons were slow-acting, designed to kill hours or days later. A servant could taste the king's food, feel fine, and then drop dead 2 days later in the laundry room. By then, the monarch had also eaten the poisoned dish and, well, mission accomplished. So really, the entire ritual of tasting was more about psychology than safety. It reassured the king, it soothed the queen's nerves. It made the whole court feel like something was being done about the poison problem. But actual protection? Not so much. The theater of safety. What's fascinating is how much of this became ritualized. Meals weren't just eaten, they were staged. The food came in under guard. Dishes were displayed, sometimes locked or sealed until the last minute. The taster sampled each one in full view of the court, as if to perform reassurance. Everyone knew the king was terrified, but everyone also knew the king had to look calm while eating. So the taster's role wasn't just culinary, it was theatrical. He was part of the performance of power, a living, breathing safety curtain between ruler and ruin. The paranoia expanded. Of course, once you start suspecting your dinner, where do you stop? Some monarchs didn't trust the cooks. Others didn't trust the servants who washed the plates. Some didn't even trust the kitchens themselves, insisting on bringing food from their own private estates, prepared under guard, with every ingredient traced back to its origin. It got absurd. A few. Rulers ate only what they personally harvested or hunted. Others used alchemists to test food for bad humors. And some had kitchens designed like fortresses, where entry and exit were controlled as if it were a bank vault. In short, dinner was exhausting. The servants who knew too much. And here's the irony. These tasters and cupbearers often became some of the most trusted people in the monarch's life. After all, they literally put their bodies on the line every day. That kind of loyalty, or perceived loyalty, gave them influence. But it was a dangerous sort of closeness. If you were too trusted, the court gossiped, maybe you weren't protecting the king, maybe you were plotting, maybe you knew too many secrets whispered over wine. Some tasters were rewarded handsomely, rising in rank. Others? They quietly disappeared when their usefulness ran out. After all, what's more disposable than a servant whose job is to die in your place? The ultimate irony, and maybe the strangest twist of all, is this. For all the paranoia, for all the ritual, for all the poor servants, sweating through every meal, most royal deaths didn't come from poison. They came from disease, from infections, from bad medical care, or simply from living long enough to suffer every ailment that a lifetime of inbreeding could throw at you. So the food tasters did their jobs faithfully, day after day, protecting their masters from a danger that, while real, it wasn't nearly as common as everyone believed. It's kind of tragic. Imagine dedicating your life to preventing the poison that never comes, while nobody can save you from the flu, or the plague, or an infected tooth. History is cruel like that. So picture this. Let's close this part with an image. A grand medieval hall, torchlight flickering on gold plates and silver goblets. The king sits at the head of the table, smiling stiffly, trying to look unbothered. The feast begins. But before every bite, before every sip, a servant steps forward, tastes, swallows, and waits. Just long enough for everyone to watch, long enough for the king to decide whether it's safe. It's dinner, yes, but it's also theatre, it's politics, it's survival, and it all rests in the hands and stomachs of the servants who risked their lives to make sure their masters could keep eating. We left off imagining that grand medieval hall, the taster nervously nibbling on what could be his last bite of bread. But let's linger here a bit longer, because royal dining wasn't just food and fear. It was also a strange blend of ritual, symbolism, and, let's be honest, pure paranoia on a silver platter. Exotic foods, exotic fears. The irony of royal meals is that while ordinary peasants were eating cabbage soup and barley porridge, monarchs demanded the most exotic dishes their cooks could manage. Peacock, roasted whole with feathers reattached for decoration. Pies stuffed with live birds that flew out when cut, because nothing says bon appétit like an angry pigeon in your face. But the fancier the food, the greater the suspicion. Imported spices could be poisoned. That fancy sweet wine from Italy, definitely suspicious. Even sugar, when it first appeared in Europe, was treated like a suspicious powder, which, to be fair, it kind of still is. It just kills you slower now. The tested rituals' different courts had their own weird routines. In Tudor England, for example, food tasters weren't just individuals. The entire kitchen staff had layers of checks. The food passed from one servant to another, each one responsible for ensuring nothing was added. By the time it reached the king, it had been handled so many times it was practically more touched than eaten. Some kings made their tasters eat far larger portions. not just a nibble. Because, you know, if you're going to be poisoned, might as well make sure you get the full dose. Very thoughtful. Trust was always fragile, but let's be real. No system of trust in a royal court was unshakable. Imagine being the king and realizing that your food taster, the guy standing right there with a spoon, is also technically a servant who could be bribed, threatened, or just tired of his job. In fact, more than one monarch suspected their tasters of being the poisoners. A neat little trick, isn't it? You taste the food, declare it safe, and hand it over. Only maybe you've built up immunity with tiny doses over time. The king eats, gets sick, and by the time anyone notices, you're quietly gone. Paranoia didn't stop at the dining table. It multiplied there. The social side of tasting. And here's another twist. Being a taster wasn't only about safety. It was also about status. When you stood up in front of the court, tasted the food, and lived, at least for the next 5 minutes, you were literally proving your loyalty in public. It was a display, a daily, very dangerous pledge of fealty. Some tasters built whole careers out of it. Survive long enough and you could earn the king's trust, perhaps even land titles, estates, or influence. Others, well, let's just say their careers ended before dessert. A quiet kind of courage. It's easy to mock the absurdity, but let's give the tasters some credit. Every meal, they woke up knowing their job was essentially, maybe die today, maybe not. That's not exactly the kind of occupational hazard you can laugh off with your co-workers.